Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Long before England had kings, castles, or anyone arguing about the weather, there was just an island covered in dense forest, rimmed by grey water, and home to people who left no written records, but did leave something arguably more impressive. Enormous rings of stone scattered across open hilltops that we still cannot fully explain, thousands of years later. Tonight, we are going all the way back not just to the beginning of England, but to the very beginning of the idea that this particular piece of land was worth living on at all. If you are new here, welcome. And if you have been with us before, genuinely glad you came back. Take a moment to hit like and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here, and drop your location and local time in the comments below too. It sounds like a small thing, but people from all over the world find their way here at the end of a long day. And there is something quietly wonderful about that someone in Melbourne at midnight, someone in Scotland at 2 a.m, all landing in the same story. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Find your position, loosen the blanket, let the shoulders settle. You do not need to follow every detail tonight, just let the story come to you. We are heading back much further than most history books bother to go to the island that would one day become England. The first humans to reach the land that is now Britain arrived roughly 900,000 years ago. We know this because of a beach in Norfolk, on the eastern coast of England, where ancient flint tools were found slowly eroding out of low cliffs at a place called Happisburgh. These tools did not belong to modern humans, not yet. They belonged to an ancestor species, probably Homo antecessor or something close to it, wandering in from what was at the time an unbroken stretch of land connecting Britain to the European continent. The island that would become England was not yet an island. It was simply the far, cold western edge of a much larger world. Those early visitors came and went with the ice. Britain's climate during this long prehistoric period shifted dramatically over tens of thousands of years. Warm enough in some stretches for hippopotamuses to wallow contentedly in the Thames, cold enough in others to be buried entirely under glacial ice. Humans followed the climate like everything else, moving in when conditions allowed, retreating southward when the cold returned, and made the land uninhabitable. By around 500,000 years ago, a species known as Homo heidelbergensis was living in Britain. Larger and more powerfully built than modern humans, they were capable of organising coordinated hunts, and they left behind butchered rhinoceros bones at a site in West Sussex called Boxgrove. They were not storytellers or monument builders. They were hunters, moving through an open landscape of grassland and scattered woodland, following the large animal herds that grazed across a world that looked almost nothing like the England we know today. Neanderthals came after them, flourishing in Britain during warmer periods between ice ages and vanishing again with each new freeze. Then, around 40,000 years ago, modern humans, our own species, Homo sapiens, pushed northward and westward into Europe and eventually reached what is now Britain. They were fully human in every meaningful sense. They made art, they carved bone, they buried their dead with apparent care. By the standards of the deep past, they were sophisticated people navigating a difficult world with considerable skill. And that world still had one significant feature it would not keep for much longer: a land bridge. For most of this long prehistory, Britain was physically connected to the rest of Europe by a low-lying landmass that geographers would eventually name Doggerland. It stretched across what is now the North Sea, a broad, marshy plain, threaded with rivers, rich in wildlife, and used by both animals and people as a natural highway between Britain and the continental mainland. If you had stood in the middle of it and looked in any direction, you would not have seen open water. Just flat, fertile ground reaching all the way to the horizon. Doggerland did not survive. As the last ice age drew to a close and global temperatures climbed, glaciers melted and sea levels rose steadily and without ceremony. Around 8,000 years ago, the waters finally closed over Doggerland for good. Britain became an island. The people already living there did not leave, they simply found themselves, slowly and over the course of generations, cut off from the world they had originally come from. The North Sea now sat permanently over what had once been home. The Britain that settled into shape after this transformation was warmer, wetter, and more heavily forested than before. Its inhabitants were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, mobile, resourceful, and extraordinarily knowledgeable about the rhythms of their environment. They fished the rivers, hunted deer through dense woodland, and gathered nuts and berries through the seasons. Their settlements were temporary. They moved with the food. Then, around 4000 BC, something fundamental changed. Farming arrived not invented locally, but carried in from the continent by new waves of migrants crossing the water in small boats. These Neolithic newcomers brought domesticated cattle and sheep, seed grain, and an entirely different relationship with the land beneath their feet. Instead of following animals, they kept them. Instead of moving with the seasons, they stayed put and shaped the landscape to fit their needs. They cleared forests, they built enclosures, and, most strikingly, they built in stone, and they built things that were not purely practical. The Neolithic period left Britain with monuments that still stand today. Long burial mounds, stone chambers, circular earthworks, and ceremonial enclosures scattered across the landscape from Cornwall to the far north of Scotland. The most famous among these is Stonehenge, sitting in open ground on Salisbury Plain in the south of England. Construction at Stonehenge began around 3000 BC and continued in phases across more than 1,000 years. The earliest version was modest, a circular earthwork ditch with a ring of pits. But over the following centuries, enormous stones were transported to the site. The blue stones from the Preseli Hills in Wales, roughly 200 miles away, and the larger sarsen stones from Marlborough Downs, each weighing as much as 25 tons. How exactly they were moved, shaped, and raised without metal tools or wheeled vehicles has kept archaeologists productively employed for generations, with each new theory arriving with considerable confidence and departing shortly afterward, once someone else ran the numbers. What Stonehenge was actually for is probably more straightforward than the mystery surrounding it suggests. It was a ritual site, oriented toward the movements of the sun, the midsummer sunrise, the midwinter sunset, serving communities who understood the seasons as matters of survival. It was a place of gathering, of ceremony, and almost certainly of burial. The bones of the dead have been found there across a span of centuries. By around 2500 BC, new arrivals, the Bell Beaker people, named after the distinctive shape of their pottery, had crossed into Britain from the continent and brought with them the knowledge of bronze. The island had rich deposits of tin in Cornwall and copper in Wales, making it a valuable place in the emerging trade networks of prehistoric Europe. Slowly, bronze tools and weapons replaced stone ones, and trade routes stretched southward toward the Mediterranean. Then came iron, and with iron came the people we know as the Celts. They were not a single group arriving in one organised migration. They were a broad cultural and linguistic family spreading gradually across much of Europe from around 800 BC onward, and their presence in Britain grew through trade, movement, and influence over several centuries. By around 500 BC, Iron Age Celtic culture was firmly settled across the island. It was a world of hill forts, large, heavily defended settlements built on high-ground tribal kingdoms, and metalwork of extraordinary quality. It was also a world that maintained complex laws, histories, and stories across generations entirely without writing. That work fell to the Druids, a priestly and scholarly class who trained for up to 20 years to hold everything they needed inside their heads. There is something quietly remarkable about a society that decided the most important knowledge was too important to be written down. Britain, on the eve of its first contact with Rome, was not a primitive backwater sitting at the edge of the known world. It was a network of tribal kingdoms, each with its own leaders, its own loyalties, and its own way of making sense of the world. The land was farmed, the rivers were fished, the hilltops were fortified, and somewhere on Salisbury Plain, a ring of enormous ancient stones stood in a field already old beyond reckoning, already quietly puzzling to the people who passed by it. The Romans were coming, and they were going to change everything. The eagles arrive. Julius Caesar was, among many things, a man who understood the value of a good story about himself. When he turned his attention toward Britain in 55 BC, the island was already a subject of considerable fascination in Rome, a mysterious, fog-shrouded place at the very edge of the known world, rumoured to be rich in tin, pearls and cattle. Whether Caesar believed all of it hardly mattered. The political theatre of crossing the ocean itself, of sailing beyond the edge of the civilized world, was the point. The actual conquest could come later. His first expedition arrived on the southeastern coast of Britain in late summer of 55 BC, with 2 legions, roughly 10,000 men, and almost immediately ran into trouble. The flat beaches ideal for landing were defended by British warriors on horseback and in chariots, and the deeper Roman warships could not get close enough to shore to unload the soldiers without exposing them to attack in the surf. The famous moment came when the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion, rather than watch the eagle of his legion be lost to the sea, jumped overboard and waded toward the shore alone. The rest of the soldiers, faced with the choice between drowning in the sea or following their standard into battle, followed him in. Caesar's forces eventually established a beachhead, skirmished with local tribes, and accepted a nominal submission from several British leaders before a violent storm wrecked a significant portion of his fleet. He patched together what ships he could and returned to Gaul before winter. In Rome, the Senate declared 20 days of public thanksgiving. Back in Britain, the locals were probably wondering what all that had been about. The following year, 54 BC, Caesar returned with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. This time he pushed further inland, crossed the Thames, and drove the powerful British war leader Cassivellaunus back to his stronghold north of the river. Cassivellaunus eventually submitted. Caesar accepted hostages and a promise of tribute, and then he left again. The tribute, it should be noted, was never paid. Britain had technically been touched by Rome, and Caesar had his story, but the island remained unconquered. It would stay that way for nearly another 100 years. During those 100 years, Britain and Rome maintained an active relationship of trade and diplomacy. Roman goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, glassware crossed the Channel in exchange for tin, wool, slaves and hunting dogs. British tribal leaders began adopting Roman customs, using Latin on their coins, and building towns that looked increasingly continental. Some even sent their sons to Rome to be educated. The island was being drawn slowly into the Roman world without a single soldier needing to march. Then, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius decided it was time to finish what Caesar had started. Claudius had reasons that went well beyond territorial ambition. He had come to power unexpectedly after the assassination of Caligula, and was widely regarded, at least in the beginning, as a weak and ridiculous figure, a stammering, limping man whom the imperial household had kept out of public life for years. He needed a military victory. Britain, still technically unfinished Roman business, offered a convenient one. He dispatched 4 legions under the command of the general Aulus Plautius, crossed the Channel, and waited in Gaul while his army did the difficult work. The invasion force landed in the southeast, probably near what is now Richborough in Kent, and moved steadily northward and westward against fierce resistance. The most significant early battles were fought at the rivers Medway and Thames, where British forces under the leaders Caractacus and Togodumnus, brothers and sons of the old king Cunobelin, mounted serious opposition. The Romans won both engagements. Togodumnus was killed. Caractacus escaped westward to fight a guerrilla campaign that would continue for years. It was at this point that Claudius himself arrived in Britain, the emperor personally crossing the ocean to oversee the ceremonial capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which served as the first Roman capital of the new province. He stayed for approximately 16 days, accepted the submission of several tribal kings, and returned to Rome to celebrate a spectacular triumph. The Senate awarded him the title Britannicus. For a man who had begun his reign as the court's embarrassing afterthought, the optics were excellent. What followed the conquest was a methodical transformation of the landscape. The Romans built roads, not tentative tracks, but engineered thoroughfares running in straight lines across the country, connecting military garrisons to supply depots and new towns to one another. Watling Street ran from the southeast coast through Londinium and on to the northwest. The Fosse Way cut diagonally across the country from the southwest to Lincolnshire, marking for a time the frontier of Roman control. These roads were built to move soldiers quickly, but they ended up moving everything: trade, information, culture, people. Londinium itself grew from a practical river crossing into the commercial heart of the province within a generation. By the end of the 1st century AD, it was the largest city in Britain, with a basilica, a forum, a governor's palace, and a port busy with ships from across the empire. Aquae Sulis modern Bath was built around a set of natural hot springs that the Romans enclosed in an elaborate complex of heated pools and temple buildings dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva. The idea of constructing a large indoor swimming pool complete with underfloor heating in one of the wettest, most persistently damp corners of the entire Roman Empire does suggest that whoever approved the project had either never visited in November or simply decided not to let the climate interfere with good architecture. Not everyone accepted the new order peacefully. In 60 AD, roughly 17 years after the conquest, a revolt erupted that came extraordinarily close to ending Roman Britain entirely. It was led by Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now Norfolk, whose husband had died, leaving his kingdom jointly to Rome and to his daughters. Rome chose to interpret this as full inheritance, annexed the Iceni territory outright, flogged Boudicca, and assaulted her daughters. The response was catastrophic for the Romans. Boudicca assembled a coalition of tribes and swept south and west, with an army estimated at well over 100,000 people. Camulodunum fell first. Its newly built Roman temple burned to the ground. Then Londinium, evacuated by the governor Gaius Paulinus Suetonius, who had been campaigning in Wales and could not return in time to defend it. Then Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Roman sources record the dead at 70,000, though Roman sources had a habit of rounding dramatic numbers upward. The 9th Legion marched south to help and was ambushed, losing its entire infantry. The destruction was total. Paulinus Suetonius eventually brought his forces together at a location chosen carefully for its geography, a narrow defile with forest at the rear and open ground in front, where Boudicca's enormous numerical advantage could not be fully deployed. The battle was one-sided in the end. The Roman lines held while the British assault broke against them, and then the legions advanced. Boudicca, according to the historian Tacitus, took poison rather than be captured. The revolt was over. Roman Britain recovered and continued. By the early 2nd century AD, the province stretched from the southeastern coast all the way to the edges of the Scottish Highlands, a distance of over 400 miles. The northern frontier was the most persistent problem the unconquered tribal peoples of Scotland, whom the Romans called the Caledonians, resisted every attempt at conquest. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian visited the province and ordered the construction of a wall across the entire width of the island, from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east. Roughly 73 miles of stone fortification, with towers, forts, and gateways at regular intervals. Hadrian's wall was not built in a day, but it was built with Roman thoroughness, and it still stands in substantial sections today, running across the northern English hills in a way that still manages to feel slightly improbable. For the next 2.5 centuries, Roman Britain settled into a working provincial life. Farmers worked the land, many of them the descendants of the same Celtic families who had fought the legions, now growing crops for military garrisons. Towns held markets, courts, and temples. Wealthy landowners built villa estates with mosaic floors, heated rooms, and formal gardens. The province was never the richest or most prestigious in the empire. That distinction went to places like North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, but it was functional, productive, and in its own modest way, prosperous. The Roman legions had turned a loose network of Iron Age kingdoms into a province, with roads connecting its edges, laws governing its people, and a shared administrative language binding it together. Whatever came next, and something was always coming next, Britain would not return to exactly what it had been before. The roads would remain long after the soldiers who built them were gone. The towns would stay, even as their names changed. And somewhere in the idea of a managed, connected, administered island, the earliest ghost of England had quietly begun to take shape. When Rome let go, empires do not end all at once. They thin out gradually, at the edges, first a garrison reduced here, a supply route abandoned there, a tax that stops being collected because there is no one left to enforce it. The end of Roman Britain did not arrive on a single dramatic afternoon. It came in stages, over the course of several difficult decades, and the people living through it would not have recognised it as an ending at all. They would have called it a crisis. They would have expected, as people in crises always do, that someone in authority was going to fix it. The troubles began long before the legions formally departed. Through the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the Roman Empire as a whole was under enormous strain pressure from Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, political instability at the centre, a succession of emperors who held power for months before being murdered by the next claimant. Britain, as a peripheral province, felt these pressures as a kind of slow hollowing out. Troops were periodically stripped from the island and sent to fight on the continent, either to defend a crumbling frontier or to support a general who had decided to make his bid for the imperial throne. The most significant of these withdrawals came in 383 AD, when a military commander based in Britain named Magnus Maximus took a large portion of the island's garrison across to Gaul in an attempt to seize the Western Empire for himself. He held power there for 5 years and nearly succeeded in his ambitions, but was eventually defeated and executed by the Emperor Theodosius. The troops he had taken with him did not come back. Britain made do with what remained, stretching its reduced forces across the same long coastlines and northern frontier, patching the gaps as best it could. Then, in 407 AD, another commander, calling himself Constantine III, stripped nearly all the remaining Roman military forces from Britain and crossed to the continent again chasing the throne, again taking the island's defenders with him. He too failed in the end, but for Britain, the outcome of his campaign was irrelevant. What mattered was that the legions were gone. The professional military infrastructure that had maintained order, guarded the frontiers, and kept the roads and towns functioning across 3.5 centuries had walked away and was not coming back. 3 years later, in 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological shock across the empire was profound. Sometime around the same period, the Emperor Honorius sent word to the cities of Britain, informing them that they would need to see to their own defence. Whether this was a formal administrative statement or simply a candid acknowledgement that Rome had more urgent problems elsewhere is still debated. Either way, it was, in practical terms, the end of official Roman rule in Britain. What came next is one of the murkiest stretches in all of English history, roughly 150 years that falls between the clear narrative of Roman Britain and the better documented world of Anglo-Saxon. England. Written sources are thin, contradictory, and often composed long after the events they describe. The historian Gilders, writing in the 6th century, is the closest thing to a contemporary account, and his work is part sermon and part lament, more interested in cataloguing the sins of British rulers than in recording accurate dates and sequences. What archaeology suggests is that the withdrawal of Roman authority did not destroy everything overnight. Towns remained inhabited, at least for a time. Local leaders of Romano-British background stepped into the administrative vacuum and tried to maintain order using the institutions they had inherited. Latin persisted among the educated. Christianity, which had spread steadily through Britain during the 4th century, continued to grow through a network of bishops and monasteries, operating largely independently of any central authority. Life went on, but in a lower key, quieter, more precarious, stripped of the supply lines and economic networks that had sustained it. The pressures came from multiple directions. From the north, the Pictish peoples of Scotland launched increasingly bold raids south of the Old Wall. From the west, Irish raiders attacked the coasts of Wales and western Britain in numbers significant enough to establish permanent settlements in some areas. And from the east, across the grey waters of the North Sea, came the arrivals that would ultimately reshape the island most completely. The peoples known collectively as the Anglo-Saxons Angles from what is now southern Denmark, Saxons from northwestern Germany, Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula had been raiding Britain's eastern coasts since at least the late 3rd century. The Romans had built a chain of forts along that coastline specifically to guard against them, a defensive system known as the Saxon Shore. With the legions gone, those defences deteriorated and the raids intensified. Gildas describes a British leader named Vortigern who, facing the Pictish threat from the north and lacking sufficient military force to repel it, made the fateful decision to invite Saxon mercenaries to settle in the east of the island in exchange for military service. The traditional date for this arrangement is 449 AD. The mercenary leaders brought over are named in later sources as Hengist and Horsa brothers. Supposedly, though the names translate from Old English as stallion and horse, which raises the mild suspicion that posterity may have taken some liberties with the original personnel records. The arrangement collapsed badly. The mercenaries fought the Picts as contracted. Then they assessed the land they had been given, found it more agreeable than the land they had come from, and sent word back to the continent that Britain was worth taking. Reinforcements crossed the sea not as hired soldiers this time, but as settlers, bringing families and communities, and the clear intention to stay. What followed across the next several decades was a process of gradual displacement that pushed the Romano-British population steadily westward, toward Wales, Cornwall, and the old kingdoms of the north. The eastern lowlands fell under Anglo-Saxon control piece by piece. Towns that had functioned for 3 centuries were abandoned or repurposed beyond recognition. The mosaic floors cracked under the feet of people who had no tradition of tiled floors. The bathhouses filled with rubble and collapsed. The Forum at Londinium, which had once been the administrative heart of the province, fell silent. The population of the city shrank dramatically. Londinium itself would not recover its Roman scale for centuries. The Romano-British did not simply disappear. Genetic evidence drawn from modern populations makes clear that the descendants of pre-Roman and Roman-era inhabitants survived in significant numbers, particularly in the western regions. The culture was being overwritten, not the people. A new language spread through the eastern lowlands, the Germanic tongue that would become Old English. New gods had come with the settlers. New burial practices, new social hierarchies, new ways of organising land and labour took root in the eastern soil, as the older Latin-speaking world retreated westward. In the west and northwest, British kingdoms held on. In what would become Wales, in the southwest peninsula, and in the old northern regions, rulers who traced their lineage back to the Roman period continued to govern in something like the old Roman manner, using Latin titles, maintaining Christian institutions, and occasionally fighting back against the eastward creep of Anglo-Saxon settlement. It is from this world, the world of the Western Britons, holding their ground in the hills, that the stories of a great war leader named Arthur would eventually emerge, centuries after the fact, gathering legend around what may have been the kernel of a real figure. A British military commander, perhaps cavalry mounted in the old Roman fashion, who managed to halt the Anglo-Saxon advance at a battle called Mount Badon sometime around the year 500 AD. Gildas mentions the battle. He does not conspicuously mention Arthur. And from somewhere in that retreating western world, a letter was written and sent east toward the continent. It reached the Roman general Aetius, who was at the time occupied with the rather pressing matter of Attila the Hun advancing across Gaul. The letter has survived in later quotation, and it is known as the Groans of the Britons. It described an island caught between two enemies, the sea on one side, the barbarians on the other, and it asked Rome, plainly and desperately, for help. Aetius did not reply. He had Attila to deal with. No help came. The Western Britons held their ground as best they could. The East continued its transformation. The Roman era in Britain was ending the way most eras end, not with a final battle or a formal ceremony of surrender, but with silence, an unanswered letter, an empty fort, a road that no one was maintaining anymore, losing itself slowly under the encroaching grass. The age of the Anglo-Saxons. By the time the dust of the migration period had settled as much as it ever did settle the island that had been Roman, Britain had become something quite different. The eastern and central lowlands were divided among a collection of Germanic kingdoms, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own warrior aristocracy, and its own understanding of where its borders ended and its neighbours began. Later historians would organise these into a tidy grouping of 7, calling it the Heptarchy: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia on the eastern bulge of the island, Essex and Kent in the southeast, Sussex along the southern coast, and Wessex spreading across the southwest. The reality was considerably messier than that neat arrangement suggests. Kingdoms expanded and contracted, absorbed smaller neighbours, split apart after a king's death, and occasionally ceased to exist entirely for a generation before reasserting themselves under a new dynasty. The map of Anglo-Saxon England was never still. What held this world together was not political unity. There was none but a shared set of cultural assumptions, a common language in its various regional forms, and a social order that, while it varied in its details from one kingdom to another, operated on broadly similar principles everywhere. At the top sat the king, the signing, whose authority rested on a combination of military success, lineage traced back to legendary ancestors, and the loyalty of the men around him. Below the king were the thengs, a warrior nobility who held land in exchange for military service, and whose relationship with their lord was the central axis of political life. Below them were the ceorls, free farmers who owned their land, paid their taxes, and served in the army when called upon. And below the ceorls were those who were not free at all, the thralls, people held in slavery through conquest, debt, or the misfortune of birth, performing the hardest labour on estates across the country. This was the world most people inhabited from one generation to the next, and it is worth pausing to take a closer look at what daily life inside it actually felt like. The typical Anglo-Saxon settlement was a small village, a cluster of timber buildings set in cleared land, surrounded by a patchwork of communal fields worked in strips by the families who lived there. The buildings themselves were sturdy and practical, rectangular timber-framed halls with thatched roofs, packed earth floors, a central hearth for fire and cooking, and very little separation between the space where people slept, ate, and worked. Larger settlements had a mead hall, a grander version of the same structure, belonging to the local lord, where feasts were held, gifts were distributed, and the bonds of loyalty between a lord and his warriors were renewed through the shared rituals of eating and drinking together. The mead hall was the political and social centre of Anglo-Saxon life, in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. It was a courthouse, a banquet room, a dormitory, and a theatre all in one. What people ate reflected what the land around them produced. Bread was the daily foundation, baked from wheat, rye, or barley depending on the region and the season. Pottage a thick, slow-cooked stew of grains, root vegetables, onions, leeks, and peas, occasionally enriched with a piece of salted pork or a handful of dried beans, appeared on the table almost every day for almost everyone. Pork was the most commonly eaten meat, since pigs could be raised cheaply on forest scraps and slaughtered in autumn for winter provisions. Beef, mutton, and poultry appeared depending on wealth and season. Fish was eaten widely, particularly in coastal communities and near rivers. Ale was universal brewed at home, consumed by adults and children alike, because the fermentation process made it safer to drink than most available water. Honey-sweetened food and drink, and mead, fermented from honey and water, was the drink of celebration and ceremony. Clothing was made at home, almost entirely from wool and linen. Men wore a belted tunic over linen breeches, with a heavy wool cloak fastened at the shoulder by a brooch when the weather required it. Women wore a long linen underdress covered by a looser woolen overgarment, cinched at the waist and often decorated at the wrists and neckline, with a cloth head covering as a matter of social convention. Colours came from plant dyes, weld-producing yellows, woad the distinctive blue, madder a range of reds. For the wealthy, imported silk appeared in small quantities, traded up through the continent from the eastern Mediterranean, used sparingly as trim or lining rather than as the main fabric of a garment. Jewellery, brooches, rings, arm rings, bead necklaces strung with glass and amber signalled status in the way that clothing alone could not always manage. Into this world, in 597 AD, came a group of 40 monks from Rome, led by a man named Augustine, dispatched by Pope Gregory I to begin the conversion of the English to Christianity. The story attached to Gregory's motivation is one of the more appealing of the period. He had apparently seen fair-haired Anglo-Saxon slaves for sale in a Roman market, asked who they were, been told they were Angles, and replied with a wordplay that must have seemed funnier in Latin that they looked not like angles but like angels, and that their souls ought to be brought to God. Whether or not this exchange actually happened exactly as recorded, Gregory clearly did send the mission, and Augustine did land in Kent. He was fortunate in his landing point. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, had a Frankish Christian wife named Bertha, and was therefore already familiar with the new religion and broadly sympathetic to its representatives. Ethelbert converted, was baptized, and gave Augustine land at Canterbury to establish his church. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that has existed in an unbroken line from that point to the present day. The institutional church in England begins, if one needs a starting point, in the Kingdom of Kent in the last years of the 6th century. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not an overnight process. It took the better part of a century, moved kingdom by kingdom, king by king, with the usual setbacks and reversals. Edwin of Northumbria, one of the most powerful kings of the early 7th century, was baptized in 627 AD, following what appears to have been a period of genuine deliberation among his nobles, the Venerable Bede. Writing a century later, preserves a famous account of one of Edwin's counsellors comparing the life of man to a sparrow, flying briefly through a warm mead hall, out of the dark and back into the dark, and suggesting that if the new religion offered any better understanding of what lay outside the hall, it was worth listening to. The image is unforgettable and characteristically Anglo-Saxon. Theological inquiry expressed through a practical observation about birds and weather. A further complication arose from the fact that Christianity came to the Anglo-Saxons from two directions simultaneously. From the south came the Roman mission through Canterbury, organised along the hierarchical lines of the Roman Church. From the north and west came the older Celtic Christian tradition, which had survived in Ireland and Scotland through the long years of the migration period, and which had different practices, most visibly a different method for calculating the date of Easter, and a different style of monk's tonsure, which sounds trivial but generated considerable institutional friction. The conflict was resolved, formally, at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, where the Northumbrian king Oswiu ruled in favour of the Roman method after deciding pragmatically that he would rather be aligned with the Pope in Rome than with the traditions of an Irish monastery, on the grounds that the Pope held the keys to heaven, and Oswiu would rather not arrive at the gate on the wrong date. The church that resulted from this process was not merely a religious institution. It became the primary vehicle of literacy, education, and written culture in Anglo-Saxon England. The monasteries that spread across the countryside through the 7th and 8th centuries were scriptoria, libraries, schools, and centres of agricultural innovation as well as places of prayer. The Venerable Bede, a monk at Jarrow in Northumbria, produced in 731 AD his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, the single most important source for early Anglo-Saxon history, and a work of such careful scholarship that it is still used today as the foundation for understanding the period. Bede was also responsible for popularising the system of dating years from the birth of Christ the Anno Domini convention that the Western world still uses in modified form today. The Anglo-Saxon world was neither dark nor culturally empty. It had its poetry, its law codes, its metalwork of extraordinary beauty. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, discovered in Suffolk in 1939, revealed a treasure of helmet, shield, sword fittings, and imported silver that demonstrated the wealth and international connections of an early 7th century East Anglian king. It had its mead halls and its storytellers, its harvest festivals, and its newly built stone churches rising at the centre of market towns. What it did not have, yet, was peace. The kingdoms competed constantly. The strong absorbed the weak. And from the sea, a new threat was beginning to take shape, one that would shake everything that had been built across these 2 centuries and nearly bring it all down. Fire from the north. The first warning came on a clear morning in the summer of 793 AD, on a small island off the northeastern coast of Northumbria called Lindisfarne. A monastery sat there, established over a century earlier by the Irish monk Aidan, and grown into one of the most revered centres of Christian learning in Anglo-Saxon England. Its monks had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of breathtaking skill, decorated with interlaced patterns and portraits of extraordinary refinement, representing some of the finest artistry in all of Northern Europe. The monastery held silver and gold liturgical objects, relics of the St. Cuthbert, and the accumulated wealth of over a century of royal gifts and pious donations. It also sat directly on the coast, easily visible from the sea, with no military garrison, no walls of any consequence, and a community whose entire way of life was organised around contemplation rather than self-defence. The longships appeared without warning. The men who came off them were Norse from Norway, most likely, and what they did to Lindisfarne shocked the entire Christian world. Some monks were killed, others taken as slaves, more thrown into the sea. The monastery was stripped of everything portable and valuable before the ships departed. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the leading intellectuals of the age and at the time working at the court of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, wrote in genuine horror to the Northumbrian king and to the surviving monks. He framed the attack as divine punishment for the sins of the English, which was the standard interpretive framework for catastrophe at the time, and stated plainly that nothing like it had been seen before in Britain. He was not wrong. The raiders had not appeared entirely without precedent. A few years earlier, in 789 AD, 3 ships had put in off the coast of Portland in Dorset, and a royal official had ridden down to meet them on the entirely reasonable assumption that they were merchants. He was killed on the beach. But Portland had been a single incident, absorbed quickly into the general background noise of coastal life. Lindisfarne was different. Lindisfarne was famous. The attack on it carried a weight that Portland could not. What had sent these men across the North Sea was a combination of circumstances that historians have been debating ever since. Population pressure in Scandinavia, limited agricultural land, an inheritance system that left younger sons with little to expect, and steady improvements in Norse shipbuilding technology had together produced a class of men, often young, often the brothers of men who would inherit the farms, who saw the sea as the only road that offered anything worth having. And the sea, it turned out, led to places of extraordinary opportunity. The Norse longship was the instrument that made all of it possible. Shallow enough in draught to be rowed directly up rivers and beached on open shores, light enough to be carried across land between waterways, seaworthy enough to navigate the open North Atlantic, and fast enough under sail to outrun nearly anything the Anglo-Saxons could put in the water against it. It was one of the most effective pieces of technology produced by any culture in the early medieval world, and its consequences for the coasts of Britain were immediate, lasting, and deeply unwelcome. Through the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the pattern was raids fast, targeted, and concentrated on the most rewarding locations. Monasteries were the obvious choice. They were wealthy by the standards of the age. They were often built on coasts or riverbanks for practical reasons. They were undefended, and the people inside them had organised their lives around prayer, manuscript copying, and agricultural work, not around the question of what to do when armed men came over the horizon. Jarrow was hit the year after Lindisfarne. Iona, the celebrated monastery off the western coast of Scotland, was raided repeatedly over several decades. Communities across Ireland, Wales, and the Frankish coast suffered the same. The Norse were not operating from any particular theological hostility toward Christianity. They raided non-Christian communities with equal enthusiasm when those communities had something worth taking. Churches and monasteries simply happened to be, by the internal logic of their own design and placement, the most convenient targets available. The monks who had chosen a beautiful coastal island for its spiritual tranquility had, without realizing it, also chosen an excellent location for someone else's purposes. For roughly the first half of the 9th century, the raids remained seasonal men crossing in spring and summer, taking what they could find, sailing home before the autumn storms. Then the pattern shifted in a way that changed everything. In 865 AD, a force that the Anglo-Saxon chronicle called the Mycel, here, the Great Heathen Army, landed on the eastern coast of England. It was different from what had come before in one critical respect. It did not leave. It wintered in East Anglia, took horses and supplies from the local king, who was hoping to buy peace at a manageable price, and in the following year turned north and marched on York. The leaders most associated with this army are the sons of a Norse warrior known as Ragnar Lothbrok Ivar, called the Boneless, along with his brothers Halfdan and Ube. Whether Ragnar himself was a genuine historical figure or a legend assembled from the accumulated reputations of several different men is a question Norse scholars have been circling without resolution for a considerable time. His sons were real enough in their effects. York fell in 866 AD. Known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eoforwic, and soon to become Jorvik under its new rulers, it was transformed into the capital of a Norse kingdom in the north. The Northumbrian kings attempted to retake it the following year, pushed through the city walls, and suffered a catastrophic defeat inside. The kingdom of Northumbria never recovered its former coherence. Norse York, over the following decades, grew into a busy and well-organised trading settlement. 20th century excavations at Coppergate revealed workshops, market stalls, and trade goods connecting it to Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Islamic world simultaneously. It was prosperous. It was simply no longer Anglo-Saxon. The great heathen army turned south. East Anglia was next. King Edmund refused to renounce Christianity or accept a position of subordination under Norse leadership, and was killed in 869 AD in circumstances that subsequent tradition shaped into martyrdom, tied to a tree and shot until he died. He was eventually declared a saint, and the Suffolk town that grew around his burial place preserves his name to this day. Mercia followed in 874 AD. The Mercian king Burgred, facing military pressure that had been grinding his kingdom down for years, chose to leave rather than fight a last battle he could not win. He went to Rome and died there in exile. A compliant replacement was installed in his place, described in the sources with the quiet contempt of someone writing about a man whose entire purpose was to do as he was told. 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had now effectively fallen. The great heathen army had, in the space of roughly a decade, dismantled a political order that had taken 2 centuries to construct. Norse settlement was spreading across the north and east in the region that would come to be called the Danelaw. Norse law, Norse place names, Norse land ownership, and Norse cultural practice were taking root alongside the existing Anglo-Saxon population. Villages whose names end today in the Old Norse suffixes of by and thorp and thwaite mark the geography of where that settlement reached. One kingdom remained standing. Wessex had watched everything unfold from close enough to understand exactly what it meant. The great heathen army had raided its borders, wintered on its territory, and probed its defences repeatedly through the 870s. Wessex had held, through military resilience, difficult terrain, and a series of agreements that bought time at cost. At the end of 875 AD, that holding pattern collapsed. A portion of the Norse forces under a leader named Guthrum moved decisively against Wessex, striking in the dead of winter, a season when campaigning was not expected and defences were at their lowest. Within weeks, the West Saxon court was scattered, the kingdom's military organisation had collapsed, and the King of Wessex was retreating through the Somerset marshes with a handful of followers and no obvious path back to anything. His name was Alfred, and he was 21 years old, and nothing about the situation suggested that this story was going to end well for him. Alfred and the burning cakes. The Somerset levels in midwinter are not a hospitable place. The land is flat, waterlogged, cut through with channels and reed beds that in the 9th century were far more extensive than they are today. A maze of marsh and boggy island territory that was difficult to navigate even for people who knew it well, and nearly impossible for an army to move through in any organised way. It was into this landscape that Alfred retreated in the early weeks of 878 AD, after the Norse leader Guthrum's winter campaign had collapsed the West Saxon military structure almost overnight. He was not alone, a small group of followers had come with him, but he was, by any reasonable assessment, finished. 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had already fallen. The fourth was, for all practical purposes, in Norse hands. The King of Wessex was hiding in a swamp. The story that attached itself to this period of Alfred's life, told in a Life of Alfred composed roughly a century after his death, involves a peasant woman and a batch of burning cakes. Alfred, sheltering in a cowherd's cottage on the island of Athelney, was asked by the woman of the house, who had no idea who her guest was, to watch some bread or flat cakes baking over the fire while she attended to other things. He agreed. Then he sat and thought about his kingdom, and the bread burned. The woman returned, found the ruined food, and told the King of England exactly what she thought of his attentiveness, in terms that were apparently direct and unambiguous. Alfred accepted the scolding. The story is almost certainly embellished and may be entirely invented, but it survived for over 1,000 years because it captures something that people found plausible about the man, that he was capable of being so absorbed in larger problems that he missed the immediate and practical one sitting directly in front of him, on fire. What is not in question is that Alfred used the Athelney period productively for whatever combination of genuine strategic thinking and enforced waiting it contained. He maintained contact with loyal West Saxon nobles across the region. He conducted small-scale raids against Norse-controlled territory to keep his presence known and to gather intelligence. And in the spring of 878 AD, he sent out messengers calling the fighting men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to assemble at a place called Egbert Stone. In the east of Somerset, they came. The force that assembled was not enormous by the standards of what it was about to face, but it was sufficient. Alfred led it eastward and caught Guthrum's army at a place called Eddington Ethandune in Old English in Wiltshire. The battle that followed was decisive in a way that few medieval engagements managed to be. Alfred's forces attacked with what the sources describe as a shield wall formation, drove the Norse army back to its fortified camp, besieged it for 2 weeks, and forced to surrender. Guthrum and his leading men asked for terms. The terms Alfred set were remarkable. He did not demand Guthrum's death or the immediate withdrawal of all Norse forces from England. He demanded, among other practical concessions, that Guthrum accept Christian baptism. The ceremony took place at a place called Aller in Somerset, with Alfred standing as Guthrum's godfather, a gesture of deliberate political symbolism, casting the relationship between the two men as one of spiritual kinship rather than pure military domination. Guthrum was given the baptismal name Athelstan, stayed at Alfred's court for 12 days afterward as a guest, and then departed. The agreement that formalised the peace is known as the Treaty of Wedmore, and it effectively divided England between them. The Danelaw, the northern and eastern regions where Norse settlement was already established, would remain under Norse political authority. Wessex, and the areas south and west of the agreed boundary, would remain under Alfred's rule. It was not a unification of England. It was an acknowledgement of reality, clearly drawn, which was itself a form of progress. What Alfred did next with the peace he had won defines his place in English history more completely than the battle itself. He understood, with unusual clarity for a king of his time, that military victory without structural reform was simply a delay. Guthrum's forces had been able to move as fast and as destructively as they had, because Wessex had no system for rapid mobilisation, no network of defensible positions, and no navy capable of engaging Norse ships before they reached the shore. Alfred spent the years following Eddington systematically building all three. The burh system was the most immediately practical of his reforms. Across Wessex, Alfred ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns, burhs positioned at intervals such that no point in the kingdom was more than about 20 miles from one of them. Each burh was surrounded by earthwork defences and maintained by the local population in proportion to the amount of land they held. The formula was calculated and written down, the Burgel Hidage, a document that survives and shows with unusual precision how the system was organised and resourced. The burhs were not merely military installations. Many of them were planned towns with streets on a grid, markets, and churches. Several of them, including Winchester, Oxford, and Wareham, became the foundations of towns that still exist today. Alfred was not just building forts. He was, in a practical sense, building England. His reorganisation of the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon citizen military force, addressed the problem of sustained campaigning. The old system required all eligible men to serve when called, which meant that extended campaigns stripped the farms of the labour needed to keep the economy functioning. Alfred divided the obligation, requiring roughly half the available fighting men to be on active service at any given time, while the other half remained to work the land, then rotating them. It was unglamorous administrative work, the kind that rarely generates legends, but it meant that Wessex could maintain a military force in the field without collapsing the agricultural system that fed it. The navy was newer still. Alfred ordered the construction of longships larger than the Norse vessels and built to his own specifications, though the sources suggest the design required some modification after the first fleet proved awkward to handle in practice, which is what tends to happen when a scholar king draws up his own ship plans. The point was not that Alfred's ships were superior. The point was that Wessex now had ships at all, and that Norse fleets would no longer arrive at the coast of England entirely unopposed. Alfred also had a streak of scholarly ambition that is unusual enough in a 9th century king to deserve attention on its own terms. He taught himself to read Latin as an adult. He had not been formally educated in the language as a child, despite being raised in a royal household that valued learning and then organised a programme of translation, bringing scholars from Wales and the continent to his court and working alongside them to render key Latin texts into Old English. His translations included Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. He wrote prefaces to these translations himself, explaining his reasoning and his goals, and the prose in those prefaces is fluent, intelligent, and direct. He also initiated the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an annalistic record of English history, maintained at several monasteries simultaneously, that would continue to be updated for nearly 3 centuries after his death. It is one of the most significant historical documents of the medieval period, and without it, reconstructing the history of early England would be significantly more difficult. Alfred did not write it himself, but the project carries his fingerprints clearly. He captured London in 886 AD, the first time the city had been under secure English control since the Norse advance, and entrusted its governance to his son-in-law, Ethelred of Mercia, a deliberate choice that extended West Saxon influence without formally annexing Mercian territory, managing political relationships with the same careful attention he applied to everything else. Alfred died in 899 AD, aged around 50, having spent nearly his entire reign managing a kingdom under extraordinary external pressure, while simultaneously reforming its foundations from within. He is the only English monarch to have received the title the Great from posterity, which is awarded rarely enough that it retains some meaning. Whether it is fully deserved depends on what one thinks deserves it. He did not unify England. He did not drive the Norse out. What he did was ensure that Wessex survived, and that the idea of an English kingdom governed by English law, sustained by English institutions, and documented in the English language remained alive at a moment when the alternative was its complete disappearance. His son and grandchildren would do the unifying, but they had something to build on because of him. One kingdom, one people. Alfred left behind a kingdom that was intact, and a blueprint for making it larger. His son Edward, who came to the throne in 899 AD and is known to history as Edward the Elder, spent the following 2.5 decades doing something that Alfred had not quite managed, taking the fight northward into the Danelaw rather than simply holding the line against it. The campaign was methodical rather than dramatic, a slow and deliberate process of advancing the West Saxon frontier through the construction of new burhs, the consolidation of conquered territory, and the careful diplomatic management of the various Anglo-Danish lords who controlled the Midlands and the North. It was not the stuff of stirring legend, but it worked. What made it work more completely than Edward could have managed alone was the partnership he maintained with his sister. Ethelflaed, Alfred's daughter, had married Ethelred of Mercia, the lord to whom her father had entrusted London, and when Ethelred died in 911 AD, she did not retire to a convent or accept a subordinate role in someone else's political arrangements. She ruled Mercia herself, bearing the title Lady of the Mercians, commanding armies in the field, ordering the construction of fortifications, and coordinating military operations with her brother in a working partnership that effectively doubled the strategic capacity of the English advance. She captured Derby in 917 AD and Leicester in 918, breaking Norse power in the Midlands with a combination of military force and political acumen. She died later that same year, before she could see the full result of what she had set in motion, and the sources that record her campaigns do so with a matter-of-factness that only partially conceals how extraordinary her position actually was. A woman ruling a kingdom and leading armies in 9th century England was not something the political framework had a category for. Ethelflaed simply occupied the space and did the work anyway. By the time Edward died in 924 AD, the Danelaw had been substantially reconquered. The Norse lords of the Midlands and East Anglia had submitted or been displaced. Norse York and the North remained outside English control, but the balance had shifted decisively. Edward's son Athelstan inherited a kingdom larger and more coherent than anything his grandfather Alfred had ruled, and he moved quickly to complete what remained. Athelstan was, by almost any measure, a formidable king. He absorbed Norse Northumbria, bringing York under English authority for the first time since its capture in 866 AD. He received the submission of the Welsh kings, the Scottish king Constantine, and the ruler of Strathclyde at a meeting in Hereford in 927 AD, establishing a ceremonial overlordship over the whole island that went well beyond anything previous English kings had claimed. His court was one of the most sophisticated in contemporary Europe. He maintained connections with the royal families of France, Germany, and the Norse world, arranged marriages for his sisters across the continent, and collected relics with an enthusiasm that his more piously inclined subjects presumably found admirable, and his treasury officials probably found costly. The defining moment of his reign came at a place called Brunanburh in 937 AD, a location that has never been identified with certainty, which has not stopped generations of historians from proposing candidates across the north of England. A coalition formed against Athelstan, Constantine of Scotland, the Norse king of Dublin, Olaf Guthfrithson, and the ruler of Strathclyde combined their forces in what appears to have been a serious attempt to break English dominance of the island. Athelstan and his brother Edmund met them and won a victory so complete that the Anglo-Saxon chronicle abandoned its usual spare prose and broke into poetry to describe it, one of the most vivid surviving examples of Old English. Verse, filled with ravens and carnage, and the particular satisfaction of a fight that goes exactly as one had hoped, Brunanburh established, as firmly as any single battle could, that there was now an English kingdom, and that it was going to remain one. The decades after Athelstan were not uniformly stable. His half-brother Edmund ruled capably until he was stabbed to death at a feast by an exiled criminal he had spotted in the crowd, and unwisely attempted to have removed personally rather than delegating the task. His successor Edred finally crushed the remaining Norse power in York in 954 AD. Then came Edwig, whose short reign was marked by a bitter conflict with the Church. And then Edgar, who ruled from 959 AD and is remembered, perhaps more than any other king of this period, as the one who got the ceremonial side of kingship exactly right. Edgar was crowned at Bath in 973 AD, in a ceremony almost certainly designed by the Archbishop Dunstan, which set the template for English coronations that endures in recognisable form to the present day. The choice of Bath itself was deliberate. A Roman city, rich with associations of an older imperial past, providing a setting of appropriate grandeur for the moment. After the coronation, Edgar was rowed on the River Dee at Chester by 8 subject kings, holding the rudder himself while they pulled the oars, an image of symbolic hierarchy so carefully staged that one suspects a significant amount of rehearsal was involved. He was called Edgar the Peaceful, which in the political language of the period was not a slight on his military capacity, but a recognition that his reign had been one of internal order and managed relations with the various rulers around him, a genuine achievement. After the instability of the preceding decades, then Edgar died, aged only 31, in 975 AD, and what followed illustrated with uncomfortable speed how much of the stability had rested on the particular capabilities of one man. His son Ethelred came to the throne in 978 AD, following the murder of his older brother Edward, a crime in which Ethelred's own household was implicated, though how much the boy himself knew or participated is impossible to say. Ethelred was around 12 years old at the time of his accession. He reigned for 38 years, which is a long time, and the historical reputation he accumulated across those decades is among the worst of any English king. His nickname, which has followed him down 1,000 years, is the Unready. This requires a small clarification that the nickname's persistence has largely obscured. The Old English word used was unrayed, meaning not unprepared exactly, but poorly counselled or lacking in good advice, and since Ethelred in Old English means noble counsel, the nickname was a deliberate pun on his own name. Ethelred Unrayed. Noble counsel, no counsel. It was the kind of wordplay that suggests his contemporaries found his failings both infuriating and faintly absurd, which is a particular combination that tends to stick. The Norse raids returned in force under Ethelred's reign. Fresh fleets from Scandinavia, unconnected to the earlier Danelaw settlements, looking for the same profitable targets their predecessors had found a century before. Ethelred's response settled into a pattern of paying them to leave. The payment was called Danegeld, and it was raised through a nationwide tax and distributed to the Norse fleets in quantities that grew with each successive demand. The strategy had the practical flaw of demonstrating reliably that England was both wealthy enough to produce large sums quickly and willing enough to pay them without sustained military resistance, which was a combination that tended to encourage return visits rather than permanent departure. In 1002 AD, Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes living in England on the feast day of St. Brice, an act of catastrophic political miscalculation that included, among its victims, the sister of the Danish king, Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn's response was to bring his army to England in earnest. By 1013 AD, Ethelred had fled to Normandy. By 1016 AD, after Ethelred's death and a brief military contest with his son Edmund Ironside, Sweyn's son Cnut had been accepted as king of all England. Cnut ruled until 1035 AD and governed with considerable effectiveness, maintaining English law, working closely with the English Church, and showing enough political intelligence to present himself as a legitimate English king, rather than a conqueror administering a foreign territory. The story of Cnut commanding the tide to turn back, for which he is most popularly remembered, is almost certainly not the story of a foolish king believing his own propaganda. It reads in its original context as a demonstration of deliberate royal humility. Cnut, placing a chair on the beach to prove to his flatterers that not even kings could command the sea, and that only God held that kind of power. The moral was sound. The staging was, admittedly, memorable. After Cnut's death, a confused sequence of short reigns eventually returned the kingdom to the old West Saxon line. In 1042 AD, a son of Ethelred named Edward came back from exile in Normandy and was crowned King of England. History would call him Edward the Confessor, and the circumstances of his reign would set in motion a crisis whose resolution would change England more completely than anything since the Anglo-Saxon migrations themselves. The year everything changed. Edward the Confessor was, in most practical respects, an unsuitable king for the times in which he lived. He was deeply pious. He would be canonized a saint in 1161 AD, genuinely intelligent, politically cautious to the point of passivity, and almost entirely uninterested in the military dimension of kingship that his predecessors had managed with such consequence. He had spent most of his youth in exile in Normandy, spoke French more comfortably than English, and returned to claim his throne in 1042 AD as something of a foreigner in his own kingdom. He surrounded himself with Norman advisors, appointed Norman clergy to English bishoprics, and imported Norman architectural ideas that produced, among other things, the original Westminster Abbey, consecrated just days before his death in a ceremony he was too ill to attend in person. His reign was not without its dramas. The most powerful political figure in England for much of this period was not the king himself, but Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, whose family had accumulated land, influence, and military power across England to a degree that made them almost a parallel royal dynasty. Harold's father, Earl Godwin, had been so dominant in English politics that he had once effectively forced Edward into a confrontation and won it. Harold himself was competent, decisive, well liked by the English nobility, and by the early 1060s widely understood to be the man who actually ran the country, while Edward attended to his prayers and his building projects. The problem that would define 1066 and reshape English history entirely was one that Edward had created, or at least failed to prevent, over the course of his childless reign. He had no heir. More precisely, he had either made promises or allowed promises to be understood regarding the succession that would prove catastrophically incompatible with one another. William, Duke of Normandy, maintained firmly, and there is reasonable evidence to support him that Edward had promised him the English crown during his years in exile, when Edward had few other friends. William further claimed that Harold Godwinson had sworn a solemn oath at some point around 1064 AD during a visit to Normandy to support his claim to the English throne. Harold himself never publicly disputed that some oath had been taken. What he disputed was its binding character, arguing, probably, that an oath extracted under circumstances of political pressure and ratified over relics he had not known were present was not the kind of oath a man was obligated to die keeping. Harald Hardrada of Norway had his own claim, rooted in a dynastic agreement between previous Scandinavian kings of England, which was legally tenuous but militarily backed by one of the most formidable reputations in the Norse world. Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, 1066. He He was buried the following day. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England on January 6th, the speed of the coronation suggesting that this had been planned rather than improvised, and that Harold's supporters understood that the succession needed to be settled as an accomplished fact before anyone with a competing claim had time to object formally. William of Normandy spent the following months building an invasion fleet and assembling an army drawn from Normandy and from ambitious men across France who had been promised English land as their reward. He secured the political blessing of the papacy, which lent the enterprise a degree of moral legitimacy that Harold, who had broken his oath, could not easily counter. Logistics, diplomacy and weather all needed to cooperate before anything could sail, and it was not until the end of September that conditions aligned. Meanwhile, England was hit from the north. Harald Hardrada of Norway sailed up the Humber with a fleet of around 300 ships and a land force of Norwegian warriors, accompanied by the exiled English Earl Tostig, who was Harold's own estranged brother, a complication that added a layer of personal bitterness to what was already a political crisis. The Norwegian army defeated the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Gate Fulford on September 20th, and then settled at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire to await the formal submission of the region. Harold received the news in the south, where he had been watching the channel for William's fleet. He moved with a speed that remains genuinely impressive, even allowing for the inevitable compression of historical narrative. He assembled his army, marched north through roughly 200 miles of English countryside, and arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, so quickly that Hardrada's forces, apparently caught entirely off guard, did not have time to retrieve their armour from the ships. The battle that followed was a complete English victory. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The survivors of the Norwegian fleet, reportedly only about 24 ships' worth of men from an original force of 300, were allowed to sail home on the condition that they never returned. Harold had been king for 9 months and had just destroyed one of the greatest Viking armies of the age. 2 days later, William landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. Harold turned his army around and marched south. He paused briefly in London to rest his forces and gather reinforcements, but the stay was short, probably shorter than his commanders would have advised, and on October 13th, the English army arrived in the hills north of Hastings and prepared for battle. Whether Harold was driven by confidence after Stamford Bridge, by the fear of what William's forces were doing to the Sussex countryside while he delayed, or by some combination of both, is a question historians have been arguing over since approximately the following week. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14th, 1066, across a ridge of ground north of the town. Harold positioned his forces in a strong defensive line along the high ground and waited. William attacked uphill, repeatedly, across the course of a long day. The English shield wall held through the morning, and at one point a section of William's army broke and ran, briefly threatening to unravel the Norman advance. What turned the battle, according to most accounts, was a combination of feigned retreats, Norman cavalry pulling back to draw English soldiers off the ridge in pursuit, then turning on the scattered pursuers and the gradual wearing down of the English line through sustained pressure over many hours. Harold died at some point during the afternoon or early evening. How, exactly, is one of the more pleasantly unresolved questions of English history. The Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered cloth of approximately 70 metres produced in the decade after the conquest, depicting the events that led to and included the battle, shows a figure falling near a Latin inscription identifying Harold's death, and also shows a figure nearby pulling an arrow from what appears to be the vicinity of his face. Whether the falling figure, the arrow figure, or both together represent Harold has been debated by scholars and interested observers for centuries without producing agreement. What is certain is that Harold died at Hastings, that his army collapsed after his death, and that William's forces controlled the field by nightfall. The conquest of England was not complete. It would take years of military campaigning, castle building, and brutal suppression of rebellion to actually consolidate Norman control across the country. But the decisive event had taken place. William marched toward London. devastated the surrounding countryside to demonstrate the cost of continued resistance, received the submission of the English nobility at Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire, and was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. The ceremony was reportedly marred by an incident at the moment of acclamation, when the crowd inside the abbey cheered so loudly that the Norman guards outside, hearing the noise and apparently having failed to account for the possibility that a coronation might generate enthusiastic sounds, assumed a riot was in progress and began setting fire to nearby buildings. The coronation continued inside while houses burned outside, in what may be the most inadvertently symbolic beginning to any reign in English history. William the Conqueror was king. England would never be quite the same again. The Normans remake the world. The England that William inherited in the winter of 1066 was not yet fully his. The coronation at Westminster had established legal possession of the throne. Actually controlling the country was a different and considerably more violent undertaking. Through the first years of his reign, William faced a series of rebellions in the southwest, in the north, and in East Anglia, each of which he suppressed with a combination of military force and deliberate exemplary punishment designed to make the next rebellion feel like too expensive a proposition to attempt. The most consequential of his responses came in 1069 and 1070, following a serious uprising in the north of England, combined with a Danish invasion that briefly gave the rebels enough military weight to recapture York. William's answer to this was the harrying of the north, a systematic campaign of destruction across Yorkshire and the surrounding region that went well beyond the military requirements of defeating an army. His forces burned villages and farmsteads, slaughtered livestock, destroyed stored grain and agricultural equipment, and salted the land so that nothing useful could grow. The intention was not merely to end the rebellion, but to prevent the region from being able to support another one. Contemporary chroniclers recorded the result in terms that leave no ambiguity. The land was left empty. People starved in large numbers. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler writing not long after the events, noted that William himself reportedly expressed remorse on his deathbed for the suffering the harrying had caused, which suggests the scale was extreme enough to trouble even its author, which is a fairly significant bar. The instrument through which William reshaped English society was the castle, not the sprawling stone fortresses that would come later, but initially simpler and faster structures, Motte and Bailey designs, a wooden tower on a raised earthwork mound, connected to an enclosed yard, that could be constructed in days and garrisoned by a small number of men who could then dominate the surrounding territory effectively. More than 80 of these were built across England in the first 2 decades of Norman rule. The Tower of London began rising on the north bank of the Thames almost immediately after the conquest. Dover Castle was reinforced. Everywhere a Norman lord was granted territory, a castle followed, making his presence in the landscape not just political but physically inescapable. The redistribution of land was total. William treated all of England as his personal property conquered territory, whose previous ownership had been legally erased by Harold's defeat at Hastings. He distributed it to his followers not as gifts but as fiefs, grants of land held in exchange for specific military obligations. Each major lord, called a tenant-in-chief, owed the king a defined number of armed knights for military service. The lords distributed portions of their own holdings to lesser lords on similar terms, who in turn granted land to individual knights, who collected rents and labour from the peasant population living on their estates. This arrangement, land flowing downward in exchange for military service flowing upward, with the king at the apex of the whole pyramid, is what historians call feudalism, and William applied it to England with a systematic thoroughness that was unusual even by the standards of the Norman world. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely replaced. A small number of English lords who had supported William or submitted early enough kept some of what they had. The rest were dispossessed. By 1086 AD, a mere 20 years after the conquest, the great majority of English land was in Norman hands. This was not just a change of names at the top, it was a wholesale replacement of the ruling class, carried out within a single generation. The language shifted accordingly. Norman French became the tongue of the court, the law, the aristocracy, and polite ambition. Latin remained the language of the church and formal written record. Old English, the language that Alfred had worked so carefully to elevate and preserve, became the language of the lower orders farmers and tradespeople, and people who had no reason to address a Norman lord. For the next 3 centuries, England was functionally a bilingual country divided along class lines, and the eventual merger of these 2 streams, French vocabulary flowing into the English grammatical framework, would produce, over time, the hybrid language that became modern English. The French words that English borrowed in this period are telling. Beef, pork, and mutton are French, the Norman lords who ate the animals, while cow, pig, and sheep are English, the Anglo-Saxon peasants who raised them. In 1085 AD, at his Christmas court in Gloucester, William commissioned what would become one of the most remarkable administrative achievements of the medieval world. He wanted to know exactly what he owned. Not approximately, not in general terms, but precisely. Who held every piece of taxable land in England, what that land was worth now, what it had been worth before the conquest in the time of King Edward, how many peasants worked it, how many ploughs it supported, how much woodland and meadow and pasture it contained. Commissioners were sent out across every county in 1086, holding local courts and collecting sworn testimony from representatives of each community about every piece of land within it. The result was compiled into 2 volumes and survives today in the National Archives. It was called Domesday Book, the name given to it not by William, but by the English people subject to it, who noted that just as on the Day of Judgment there was no appeal from the verdict of God, there was equally no appeal from the findings of William's surveyors. A man could argue with a neighbour about what his land was worth, but he could not argue with the book. Its thoroughness was without precedent in medieval Europe, and the detail it contains about English society in the late 11th century, who owned what, where, and under what conditions, has made it an invaluable historical document for 900 years of scholars who came after. William died in 1087 AD, not in England, but in northern France, from injuries sustained when his horse stumbled at Mantes during a military campaign and threw him forward onto the pommel of the saddle. He lingered for weeks before succumbing. His deathbed, by multiple accounts, was not a dignified affair. His attendants and household, knowing he was dying and concerned about their own positions in what came next, quietly removed themselves and their valuables. His body was left largely unattended, stripped of its remaining possessions by opportunists, and then transported to Caen in Normandy for burial. At the funeral, when the attendants attempted to lower the corpse into a stone sarcophagus that had been made slightly too small, the body swollen from the weeks of illness would not fit. The subsequent events, described with a certain grim specificity by the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, caused a significant portion of the mourning congregation to leave the church before the ceremony was concluded. It was not the ending that the conqueror's reputation suggested he deserved, though one might argue it was characteristically uncompromising in its own way. England passed to his second son, William Rufus, red-faced, energetic, crude in manner, effective as a soldier, and profoundly unpopular with the church he consistently plundered for funds. He was killed in the New Forest in 1100 AD by an arrow during a hunting expedition, in circumstances that have never been entirely explained, and that a noticeable number of contemporaries did not seem particularly interested in investigating thoroughly. His younger brother Henry moved to secure the treasury and the throne with a speed that suggested he had been giving the subject some prior thought. Henry I was the ablest administrator of the 3 sons, methodical, literate, interested in law and governance in ways that his brothers had not been. His reign of 35 years produced a more sophisticated royal administration and a document called the Charter of Liberties, in which Henry made certain promises to his barons about the limits of royal behaviour, promises that would echo, a century later, in a meadow beside the Thames with considerably more weight behind them. But the defining event of Henry's reign arrived not as a political crisis, but as a personal catastrophe. In November of 1120 AD, a ship called the White Ship, carrying his only legitimate son William along with around 300 members of the English and Norman nobility, sank in the Channel after leaving the port of Barfleur. The ship's crew had been drinking. Only one man survived. Henry never remarried successfully enough to produce another male heir, and when he died in 1135 AD, reportedly and perhaps apocryphally, after eating too many lampreys, he left behind a succession dispute that would tear the country apart. Kings, barons, and a field at Runnymede. Henry I's death, without a clear male heir, produced exactly the kind of succession crisis that medieval kingdoms were most vulnerable to, one where two claimants had roughly equal legitimacy, roughly comparable support among the nobility, and roughly equal willingness to prosecute their claim through extended military violence. On one side was Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, who had moved quickly to secure the treasury and the loyalty of key barons and the church. On the other was the Empress Matilda, Henry's daughter, who had been formally designated his heir and had the stronger legal claim but a political manner that contemporaries described, with some consistency, as imperious to the point of alienating the very people whose support she needed. The civil war that resulted lasted from 1135 to 1154 AD and is known as the Anarchy, a name that captures the general texture of the period accurately enough. Neither side could deliver a decisive military blow. The country fragmented into competing baronial lordships. Castles were built without royal permission and used as bases for local extortion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry for the period contains a description of what the common people suffered that reads with an unusual rawness. Even by the Chronicles' generally spare standards, men hung by their thumbs, taxed into starvation, their crops burned and their livestock taken. The anarchy ended not through military victory, but through exhaustion and negotiation. Stephen agreed, in the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 AD, that Matilda's son Henry would succeed him. Stephen died the following year, and the young man who arrived from the continent to claim England in 1154 AD was unlike either of his predecessors in almost every meaningful way. Henry II was 21 years old, physically energetic to a degree that reportedly exhausted his court, intellectually curious, administratively gifted, and possessed of a temper that was capable of producing consequences he would spend years attempting to undo. He had inherited not just England, but a vast collection of continental territories, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the enormous Duchy of Aquitaine in southern France, making him the ruler of more land than the French king himself. He was the first of the Plantagenet dynasty, taking the name from the Latin for the broom plant, Plantagenista, that featured in his family's heraldry, and his reign would set the institutional foundations of English law in ways that persist to the present day. Henry's great domestic project was the rationalisation of the English legal system. He extended the reach of royal courts at the expense of local baronial and church courts, developed the use of travelling royal judges who brought standardised legal procedures to every part of the country, and promoted the principle that legal disputes over land should be settled by a jury of local people giving sworn testimony, rather than by trial, by combat, or by the older ordeal-based methods. The common law that emerged from his reforms built on precedent, applied consistently across the country, administered by royal courts, is the direct ancestor of the legal system that England and many of its former colonies still use today. His relationship with the Church produced the defining catastrophe of his reign. Thomas Becket had been Henry's close friend and Lord Chancellor before Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 AD, apparently expecting that having his ally in the most powerful ecclesiastical position in England would smooth his plans for extending royal authority over church courts. Becket, once in post, became instead a vigorous defender of church independence a transformation so complete that contemporaries struggled to explain it, and historians have been debating it ever since. The two men quarrelled, reconciled imperfectly, quarrelled again, and in December of 1170 AD, after Henry reportedly expressed his frustration in terms that 4 of his knights interpreted as authorization to act, Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral during evening prayers. The killing sent shock across the Christian world. Henry performed public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and submitting to a flogging by the monks, a scene of theatrical self-abasement that served the political purpose of containing the damage, while making absolutely clear how seriously the situation had escalated. Becket was canonized within 3 years of his death. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe, and the story of the king and the archbishop became a fixed point in the English historical imagination that it has never entirely left. Henry's final years were consumed by rebellions from his own sons, including Richard, who would succeed him, and John, who would outlast them all. He died in 1189 AD, reportedly having just received a list of the barons who had joined his son Richard's latest revolt against him, and finding his own name John among them. Richard I inherited the English throne and used it primarily as a funding mechanism for the Third Crusade, which he led with genuine military distinction in the Holy Land, and then failed to complete before being captured on his return journey and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria. England spent years raising the enormous sum required to free him. Richard was eventually returned, surveyed his kingdom briefly, remarked in a recorded moment of unusual candour that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer, and went back to France to continue campaigning. He was killed by a crossbow bolt at a minor siege in 1199 AD, having spent roughly 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. He is remembered as one of the great warrior kings of the medieval period. The English, largely, paid for the privilege of this reputation. John was everything his brother was in battle, and considerably less in almost every other respect. He began his reign by losing the bulk of England's continental possessions. Normandy fell to the French king Philip Augustus in 1204 AD, cutting the Norman nobility of England off from their ancestral lands in a single campaign, and forcing a generation of Anglo-Norman lords to make a definitive choice between being French or being English. John's attempts to recover these territories through subsequent campaigns failed, at considerable financial cost to his barons, who were taxed to fund military expeditions that produced nothing useful. By 1215 AD, the relationship between John and his barons had deteriorated beyond repair. He had manipulated the feudal system in ways that even the period's elastic standards of royal behaviour found excessive seizing heirs as hostages, demanding arbitrary financial payments, using the machinery of royal justice as a personal instrument of revenge and extortion. A group of rebel barons, having captured London, confronted him with a set of demands that had been worked out in detail over the preceding months. The meeting took place in June of 1215 AD, in a meadow at Runnymede on the south bank of the Thames between Windsor and Staines. John arrived, looked at the situation, and signed. The document he agreed to, Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was in its immediate practical terms, a list of specific feudal grievances and the remedies John was agreeing to apply. It addressed the rights of barons to be taxed only with the consent of a council, the rights of free men to be tried by their peers under established law, the independence of the church, and the obligation of the king to apply the law consistently rather than wielding it as a personal weapon. Much of it was technical, specific, and would need considerable interpretation before it applied meaningfully beyond the baronial class for which it was primarily written. But buried in its clauses was something that went further than its authors may fully have intended. The principle that the king was subject to the law, not above it, not its source in any arbitrary personal sense, but bound by it, like everyone else, was stated clearly enough that subsequent generations of lawyers and reformers could reach back to it whenever they needed a foundation for the argument that power had limits. John repudiated the charter almost immediately. The Pope annulled it, and civil war resumed within months. But Magna Carta was reissued, revised, and reconfirmed numerous times over the following century by John's successors, gradually acquiring the authority of an established constitutional settlement. It is the document that stands at the beginning of the long argument about what English governance was supposed to mean, an argument that would run for another 4 centuries before it produced a parliament with real power, and longer still before it produced anything approaching democracy. But the argument had a starting point now. A king had admitted, in writing, that there were things he could not do. Plague, war, and the world turned upside down. The 13th century had, in its complicated way, been a period of institutional growth. Henry III, John's son, reigned for 56 years and spent much of them in conflict with his barons, whose leader Simon de Montfort convened a gathering in 1265 AD that included not just nobles and clergy, but elected representatives from the towns and counties, a moment often cited as the earliest recognisable ancestor of the English Parliament, though de Montfort himself was killed in battle the same year, and the immediate political crisis was resolved against him. The seed, however, had been planted. Edward I, who followed, was a harder and more systematic king. He conquered Wales, hammered the Scots into prolonged and furious resistance, expelled the Jewish population of England in 1290 AD in an act of brutal administrative convenience, and developed Parliament from an occasional royal tool into a more regular institution, partly because he needed its consent to raise the taxes his military ambitions required. England at the turn of the 14th century was more institutionally complex than it had been at any point since the Romans, and considerably more fractious. Edward II proved unequal to what his father had built. He was defeated catastrophically by Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314 AD, effectively ending English hopes of subduing Scotland for a generation, and spent his reign in a losing struggle against baronial opposition that eventually deposed him. He died in Berkeley Castle in 1327 AD, in circumstances that his captors ensured were untraceable, but that contemporaries discussed with dark specificity. Edward III, by contrast, was exactly what the period seemed to require, a confident military king who channeled English energy outward toward France rather than inward toward the throne. The 100 Years' War, which began formally in 1337 AD and would consume English foreign policy for over a century, was his project. He claimed the French throne through his mother, organised an extraordinarily effective English military system built around the longbow, and in 1346 AD won the Battle of Crécy in northern France against a French force significantly larger than his own. His son, Edward the Black Prince, repeated the achievement at Poitiers in 1356 AD, capturing the French king John II in the process. England, for a moment, appeared to be winning the world. Then, in the summer of 1348 AD, a ship arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and the calculation changed entirely. The disease that the sailors carried had been moving westward across Europe for several years. It had begun somewhere in Central Asia, reached the Black Sea ports, and travelled from there along the established trade routes of the Mediterranean world, leaving behind a mortality that contemporary observers struggled to describe because nothing in their experience provided an adequate comparison. By the time it reached England, it had already killed somewhere between a third and a half of the population of the Italian city-states swept through France and cut through the Iberian Peninsula with similar thoroughness. The name it would eventually be given, the Black Death, was not contemporary. People at the time called it the pestilence, or the Great Mortality, or simply the Plague, and they watched it arrive with a mixture of terror and a helpless theological bewilderment about what sin could possibly have warranted a punishment of this scale. The disease was primarily bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on black rats and transmitted to humans through bites. It also manifested in a pneumonic form that spread directly between people through respiratory droplets and killed even faster. The bubonic form produced the swollen, blackened lymph nodes, buboes, that gave it its later name, along with fever, vomiting, and death within days in many cases. Medieval medicine had no effective treatment, limited understanding of contagion, and no way of stopping what was, in practical terms, unstoppable. The plague moved through England with terrible efficiency through 1348 and 1349, killing across all social classes and in every region. Estimates of the English death toll vary, but the consensus of modern historical scholarship places it at roughly a third to half of the entire population, somewhere between 2 and 4 million people out of a pre-plague total of perhaps 5 or 6 million. Entire villages were emptied. Monasteries, where communal living made the mnemonic form particularly lethal, were devastated. Some communities lost every member within weeks. The administrative machinery of the church struggled to function when half the clergy were dead, and the survivors were fully occupied performing last rites for the dying. Parliament itself was dissolved in 1349, after members began dying during the session. The agricultural system, which was built on a surplus of cheap labour extracted from a peasant class with no legal recourse against their obligations, ran directly into the new economic reality that roughly half that labour force had ceased to exist. Land that had been cultivated for generations reverted to scrub because there was no one to work it. Lords who had previously commanded labourers at fixed, customary rates found that the surviving workers, understanding perfectly well that their scarcity had shifted the balance of power, demanded wages. Some lords paid, others attempted to enforce the old obligations by law. In 1351 AD, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, which tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels and compel workers to accept employment at those rates. The statute was resented, widely evaded, and ultimately futile. The economic logic of the situation was more powerful than the legal machinery designed to suppress it. The full social consequence of this shift took decades to manifest, but its direction was clear from early on. The feudal order, which had depended on the immobility and legal subordination of a large peasant class, was eroding from below. Serfs who had previously been legally bound to the land they worked began leaving their manors to seek better wages elsewhere, knowing that lords desperate for labour were unlikely to spend resources pursuing individual runaways. The manorial system that had organised English rural life for 3 centuries was not destroyed overnight, but it was being hollowed out by simple economic pressure. The generation that grew up in the aftermath of the Black Death carried a particular kind of resentment, the awareness that the old order had required them to do the hardest work for the smallest share of what their labour produced, and that the world had now shown clearly that it could not function without them. The spark that ignited this resentment into open rebellion came in 1381 AD. A poll tax, a flat payment demanded from every adult in England regardless of income, had been levied 3 times in the preceding 4 years, each time at a higher rate. In June of 1381 AD, a group of men in Essex refused to pay. The refusal spread rapidly across Essex and Kent, drawing in tens of thousands of people under leaders including Wat Tyler of Kent and an itinerant priest named John Ball, who had been preaching a theological radicalism that the authorities found alarming enough to imprison him for. His most famous sermon contained a question that was doing significant ideological work for its moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The rebel army marched on London, entered the city with the apparent sympathy of much of its population, burned the palace of John of Gaunt, the king's powerful uncle, and the most prominent symbol of the ruling class's accumulated wealth, and opened the prisons. The 14-year-old King Richard II rode out to meet them at Smithfield, promised reforms, and watched Wat Tyler be struck down by the Lord Mayor during the negotiations in circumstances that were violent and confused enough to end the meeting abruptly. Richard kept the rebels from immediate vengeance by reportedly riding forward himself and telling them he would be their leader. They dispersed. The promised reforms were revoked almost immediately. The peasants' revolt was suppressed, but it had demonstrated something that could not be unsuppressed. The peasantry of England had marched on London, occupied it, and forced a king to negotiate. The feudal order survived the revolt itself, but its psychological foundations, the assumption that the lower orders were simply a fixed and permanent feature of the landscape, no more capable of political action than the soil they worked, had been permanently altered. England moved forward into the late 14th and early 15th centuries, carrying all of this accumulated disruption. The 100 Years' War continued in exhausting cycles of campaign and truce. Henry V, who came to the throne in 1413 AD, briefly seemed to resolve everything at once. His victory at Agincourt in October of 1415 AD, where an English force depleted by illness and outnumbered on unfamiliar ground destroyed a much larger French army in an afternoon, entered the English historical imagination as the defining image of military grace under impossible pressure. He secured the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 AD, which would have made him heir to the French throne itself. He died in 1422 AD, aged 35, of dysentery in France, before he could claim it. His heir was 9 months old, and the 100 Years' War had, in its way, another 30 years left to run. The Rose Wars. The 100 Years' War ended not with a battle, but with a collapse. By 1453 AD, England had lost virtually everything it had spent over a century fighting to hold in France. Normandy gone in 1450, Gascony and Bordeaux gone in 1453, the dream of an English crown on the French throne effectively finished. What came back to England was a large number of soldiers with no war left to fight, a political class humiliated by the scale of the loss, and a king entirely unsuited to managing either the anger or the consequences. Henry VI was the son of Henry V, and had inherited his father's throne at 9 months old. He grew into a mild, pious, and genuinely good-natured man who was temperamentally suited to a life of monastic contemplation and demonstrably unsuited to the brutal political environment of 15th century English kingship. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, which are lasting contributions to English life. But he struggled to assert authority over the powerful nobles around him, tended to rely on favourites who attracted resentment, and was unable to prevent the factional conflicts of his court from escalating into something considerably more serious. In 1453 AD, the same year that the last English territory in France fell, Henry suffered the first of several episodes of complete mental collapse, falling into a catatonic state in which he was apparently conscious of nothing around him, could not speak or respond, and had to be managed like a man already absent from himself. He remained in this condition for over a year. During that period, the most powerful claimant to the throne after Henry himself was Richard, Duke of York, who had served as a military commander in France, and watched the English position there disintegrate with a mixture of military frustration and political calculation about what the failures meant for the men responsible. Richard became protector during the worst of Henry's illness. Henry recovered. Richard was removed from his position. The factions that had been forming around these two men through years of court rivalry hardened into something approaching organised opposition. The first open military engagement came at St Albans in May of 1455 AD, where a brief battle between Yorkist and Lancastrian forces killed several prominent lords and established that the conflict was no longer going to be resolved through court politics alone. The names that history attached to the two sides, Lancaster and York, the Red Rose and the White Rose, are somewhat misleading in their tidiness. The emblem of the Red Rose was not widely used as a Lancastrian symbol during the conflict itself. It gained prominence largely in retrospect, particularly under the Tudor dynasty that followed. The actual war was fought between dynastic factions, whose composition shifted repeatedly, whose allegiances were held together by a mixture of land interests, personal loyalty, and calculated self-advancement, and whose participants frequently changed sides when the calculation changed. The roses came to represent something cleaner and more symmetrical than the conflict actually was. What the conflict actually was, in its most physical dimension, can be measured by the Battle of Towton, fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire on March 29th, 1461 AD. This engagement between the Yorkist forces of Edward, Richard of York's eldest son, and the Lancastrian army of Henry VI was fought across an open field in bitter winter weather, in conditions where the wind was blowing directly into the Lancastrian lines, giving the Yorkist longbowmen a range advantage that compounded into catastrophe as the Lancastrian archers fired short and the Yorkists advanced. The defeated army was pursued and killed as it fled. The estimates of the dead range from between 9,000 and 28,000 men, making it the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil by any reasonable measure. The snow, chroniclers recorded, ran red for a considerable distance around the field. Edward IV, Yorkist, became king in 1461 AD. He was everything the period's idea of a king required: tall, physically impressive, militarily confident, and politically capable when he chose to apply himself, and his reign stabilised England after years of factional warfare in ways that his predecessor had been unable to manage. His great political error was a secret marriage in 1464 AD to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively modest standing by royal standards. The marriage itself was not the problem so much as the consequences. A large Woodville family suddenly elevated to positions of wealth and influence, displacing the existing nobility from positions they had expected to fill, and particularly alienating the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, who had done more than any other single man to put Edward on the throne. Warwick's response to his displacement was the most dramatic act of political reinvention in a period full of dramatic reinventions. He switched sides. He allied himself with the Lancastrian cause, engineered Edward's temporary exile, brought Henry VI out of the Tower and back to the throne in 1470 AD, and was briefly the most powerful man in England, simultaneously the man who had made a Yorkist king and the man who had restored a Lancastrian one, a distinction that required a certain comfort with contradiction. Edward returned from exile in 1471 AD with a rebuilt army, landed in Yorkshire, marched south, gathering support, and met Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in April of that year. Warwick was killed. A thick morning fog during the battle contributed to a catastrophic friendly fire incident in the Lancastrian lines that turned the tide before the outcome was otherwise clear. Henry VI was returned to the Tower. The following month, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, the last significant Lancastrian military force was destroyed, and Henry's son Edward, Prince of Wales, the last direct male heir of the Lancastrian line, was killed in the fighting or immediately afterward. Henry VI died in the Tower of London shortly after. The official explanation was that he expired from grief and displeasure. Contemporary observers were not entirely convinced. Edward IV spent the rest of his reign in relative stability, consolidating royal finances, developing trade, managing his fractious nobility with a combination of firmness and generosity that kept the most dangerous conflicts below the level of open warfare. His younger brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had switched sides during the Warwick episode and then switched back, was eventually attainted for treason in 1478 AD and executed. The manner of his execution entered legend almost immediately. He was reportedly drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, which was either a darkly theatrical choice or a piece of posthumous mythology, and which subsequent centuries have never quite been able to leave alone. Edward died suddenly in April of 1483 AD, aged 40, leaving behind a 12-year-old heir and a political situation that his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, assessed with considerable speed and no apparent hesitation. Richard was a capable military commander who had served Edward loyally throughout his reign, governed the north of England with genuine effectiveness, and now found himself protector of a kingdom whose young king was surrounded by the Woodville family he had no reason to trust. Richard moved quickly. He intercepted the young Edward V and his escort on their way to London, took the king into his own custody, removed the Woodville lords from their positions, and installed his nephew in the Tower officially as a residence, as was customary before coronations, but in practice as a secure location. A few weeks later, young Richard, Duke of York, Edward's younger brother, joined him there. The boys were seen occasionally at the tower windows through the summer of 1483 AD, and then were not seen at all. What happened to the princes in the tower has remained one of the most debated questions in English history for 500 years. They were almost certainly dead before the year was out. Who ordered their deaths and under what circumstances has never been established beyond reasonable doubt, and the question generates a level of continued passionate argument that suggests the disappearance of 2 children in a tower still has the capacity to disturb in ways that larger political events do not. Richard III was crowned on June 26, 1483 AD. He would reign for just over 2 years, and in a marshy field in Leicestershire, a Welshman with a tenuous claim to the English throne was already beginning to make his plans. Bosworth Field and the last medieval king. Richard III governed England for 2 years and 2 months, and those who have studied his brief reign most carefully tend to agree that he was trying, in his way, to be a competent king. He issued legal reforms, abolished the practice of benevolences, forced loans extracted from wealthy subjects by previous monarchs, and established what would become the Council of the North, an administrative body for governing the northern regions that his predecessors had managed poorly. He was attentive to the machinery of government, understood the law, and carried the experience of years of loyal and effective service in the north of England before he ever came to the throne. None of this erased the question of the princes, which hung over his reign from the beginning and which he could neither answer nor escape. The closer one looked at the legitimacy of his position, the more clearly that question sat at its centre. Henry Tudor was 28 years old in August of 1485 AD, had spent most of his life in exile, first in Brittany, then in France, and possessed a claim to the English throne that was, by the standards of the competition, somewhat strained. His connection ran through the Beaufort family, descendants of John of Gaunt's legitimised relationship with Catherine Swynford, and the legitimisation had originally come with a parliamentary clause specifically excluding the Beauforts from the royal succession, which subsequent royal descendants had quietly set aside. On his father's side he was descended from Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier who had secretly married Henry V's widow. The claim was there, but it required careful handling and considerable goodwill to hold together. What Henry had, beyond the claim, was the backing of the French king, the support of the exiled English Lancastrian remnant, and the political intelligence to understand that the real question in 1485 AD was not whether his bloodline was impeccable, but whether enough powerful men in England had decided that Richard III needed to be replaced. The evidence suggested that several of them had. The previous autumn, the Duke of Buckingham, who had helped Richard to power, had risen in revolt and been executed, demonstrating both that Richard's support was shakier than it appeared, and that premature action was fatal. Henry watched from France and continued his preparations. He landed at Mill Bay near Dale in Pembrokeshire, in southwest Wales, on August 7th, 1485 AD. He had about 2,000 men. Wales was the ground where a Tudor could reasonably expect sympathy. His father's family came from there, and he moved through the landscape invoking Welsh identity and the old prophecies of a British king who would restore his people's dignity. The response was better than adequate. By the time he crossed the English border and moved through the Welsh marches, his force had grown substantially. More importantly, the Stanley family, Thomas Lord Stanley and his brother William, who between them commanded a significant military force, had communicated their general sympathy without yet committing to a side. They were watching, as they had been watching for some time, to see how the balance moved. Richard knew Henry was coming. He had known for weeks and had assembled a substantial army at Leicester. He moved out to meet the Tudor force in the rolling countryside of Leicestershire, near the town of Market Bosworth on August 21st. The two armies camped within sight of each other and prepared for the following morning. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22nd, 1485 AD, lasted roughly 2 hours and turned on a single decision made at its critical point. The opening stages went reasonably for Richard. His artillery and archers forced the Tudor lines, and the Lancastrian advance under the Earl of Oxford was pressed hard enough to require regrouping. But the Stanleys remained on the flanks, uncommitted, waiting. Richard sent word to Thomas Stanley, demanding he join the battle, or his son, held by Richard as a guarantee of Stanley loyalty, would be executed. Stanley replied that he had other sons. His forces did not move. What happened next is described in the sources in terms that suggest either brilliant boldness or catastrophic miscalculation, and may have been both simultaneously. Richard spotted Henry Tudor himself, positioned away from the main fighting with a smaller bodyguard, and made a decision that was entirely in keeping with the medieval tradition of personal kingship. He would ride directly at Henry, kill him, and end the battle in a single stroke. He led a cavalry charge across the field, cutting through the outer edge of the Tudor lines and coming close enough to Henry that his standard-bearer was killed and Henry himself was in genuine danger. At that moment, William Stanley committed his forces for Henry. Richard's cavalry charge was engulfed. He was unhorsed in the marsh at the field's edge and surrounded. The accounts of his final moments, while filtered through Tudor sympathetic sources, are consistent in describing a man who fought until he had no ground left to fight on. He was killed, his body stripped, and his crown or coronet, found reportedly in a hawthorn bush on the battlefield, was placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley. Richard III was 32 years old. He was the last English king to die in battle and the last Plantagenet monarch. His body was buried without ceremony at Greyfriars Church in Leicester. It lay there, forgotten, for over 500 years, until archaeologists in 2012 AD excavated a car park and found his skeleton under it, curved spine, battle wounds, and all in one of the more improbable footnotes to any medieval story. Henry VII rode to London and began the work of transforming a military victory into a functioning monarchy. The first and most symbolically important step was his marriage. In January of 1486 AD, to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III, uniting the two houses whose conflict had consumed England for 30 years. Their union produced the Tudor rose, combining the red and the white, which became the emblem of a dynasty that would hold the English throne for over a century and reshape every institution it inherited. What had been built and broken and rebuilt across the 15 centuries covered in this story was, by 1485 AD, an accumulation of extraordinary density. The roads the Romans had laid still ran across the landscape, many of them surviving as foundations beneath modern routes. The cathedral cities the Anglo-Saxons and Normans had raised still organised the country's religious life. The common law that Henry II had systematised was the law of every English court. The Parliament that had grown from baronial resistance to royal excess was now a permanent feature of the Constitution. The English language, that improbable merger of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French with Latin underneath it all, was the tongue of a literate, commercially active population that had survived plague, conquest, and dynastic war, and arrived, tired but intact, at the threshold of a new century. Ancient England had left its marks in stone and bone and DNA, in the shape of the landscape, in the ring of standing stones on a Wiltshire plain, in the genetic inheritance of people who had been on this island since before it was an island. Roman England had left its roads, its towns, its legal instincts, and the first experiment in making the island part of a larger organised world. Anglo-Saxon England had left its language, its common law, its church, and the foundational idea that an English kingdom was a thing worth having and defending. Viking England had left its blood in the north and east, its place names across half the map, and the particular pressure that had forged Alfred's reforms. Norman England had left its castles, its cathedrals, its French vocabulary, and the feudal architecture of land and obligation that took centuries to dismantle. Plantagenet England had left its legal traditions, its parliament and its Magna Carta, the written acknowledgement that power had limits, and that those limits could be demanded, in writing, by the people subject to it. None of these inheritances were clean or uncomplicated. They had all been purchased at costs that the people who paid them rarely chose willingly. The serfs who worked the Norman manors had not chosen the feudal system. The people who died in the harrying of the North had not chosen William's interpretation of rebellion. The millions who died in the Black Death had not chosen the plague. History at this scale is not a story of progress, so much as a story of accumulation, the layering of one world on another, each leaving something behind, each shaping what the next one had to work with. The England that Henry VII inherited in 1485 AD was recognisably the same island that the Neolithic farmers had cleared and planted 4,500 years earlier. It had different gods now, different languages, different kings and laws and social structures. But it was still the same grey-watered, fog-touched, rain-receiving, stubbornly persistent island at the edge of a continent, and the people on it, as they had always done, were already making plans for what came next. And that is where we leave medieval England tonight, at the edge of a new world, with an old one folded carefully beneath it. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on screen right now. Just look up and you will find it. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to leave a like, hit subscribe, or drop a thought in the comments below. It genuinely means something to know you are here. For now, let your shoulders go, let your eyes close. The kings and battles and plague carts and longships are all a long, long time ago. You are somewhere warm and quiet, and there is nothing left to do tonight but rest. Good night,